Please support my work by subscribing, sharing, liking, and commenting on this video. You can also support me by becoming a Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. Links in description. This is part 2 of the India-Pakistan 1971 war series. Please watch part 1, links in description. Threat to India. In 1971, Pakistan military establishment escalated its campaign against Bengalis in East Pakistan. The political crisis led to them initiating and escalating the campaign to the level of genocide. Millions of refugees started fleeing East Pakistan into neighboring Indian states. The mayhem in East Pakistan posed a serious threat to India. Approximately 10 million refugees imposed severe economic burden on India. The presence of these refugees caused a serious law and order issue and had the potential of disrupting communal harmony across the nation, posing a clear threat to Indian national security. India could not permit the situation to continue for a long period, and it was desired to bring an end to problems in East Pakistan sooner to avoid conditions of instability in India. It was April 1971, and the Indian side was assessing the options it had to end this conflict. A military solution seemed like the only avenue, but India faced some challenges in executing it. After 1962 and 1965, India faced a two-front threat from Pakistan and China, for which it needed to recalibrate its foreign policy and national security paradigm, while maintaining a capability for a two-front war situation. It needed to fulfill three conditions for any influence it could cause on the situation in East Pakistan. Indian military's combat readiness. The Indian military was not ready for a full-scale war, and it needed time to complete its expansion and re-equipment program for the new threat. A few months were needed to complete all these activities. Chinese threat is minimized. Owing to the open passes during the summers along the Indo-China border, the Indian side had to deploy significant forces there to act as a deterrent to any Chinese incursions. Unless the Chinese threat was minimized, the Indian military would have to continue to watch its back while conducting operations in East Pakistan. During the winters, these passes would be closed, so any incursions from that side would be limited. Although these passes would start reopening by February, so operations would have to be concluded by then. Mukti Bahini. The Bangladesh Liberation Resistance Movement, the Mukti Bahini, was still in its nascent stage and needed time to acquire a degree of operational capability that could have a tangible impact in the conflict. The Indian side started actively equipping and training the Mukti Bahini, but a few months were needed for the training and expansion to complete. The months of April and May were considered unsuitable for hostilities in the east, as monsoons would soon follow, which would preclude any major movements in the marshy and riverine terrain of East Pakistan. The ground would remain unsuitable for operations till the beginning of winters. All these conditions meant that the window of conducting operations in the east would open sometime in mid-November, and all operations would have to be completed by February before the passes across China opened back up. This gave the Indian side around a 10-week window to initiate and conclude the operations in East Pakistan. The ideal time for initiating operations was by the end of November and the beginning of December 1971. India would also have to brace for pressure from the international community to declare ceasefire within a few weeks of the start of hostilities. The USA and China were supporting Pakistan during this period and were expected to come out strongly in its favor. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi signed the Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty on August 9, 1971, to counter some of the international pressure on it. Pakistan's strategy was to hold off Indian advance into East Pakistan long enough for the international community to force a ceasefire. Their estimation was 8 weeks would be long enough to force the ceasefire. On the east side, Pakistan military planners expected India to have set battles, where the Indian forces would come into Pakistan territory, attack a major military target, secure it, and then move forward. They did not have enough numbers to defeat the Indian side in the war, so their definition of victory was to stop India from achieving its objective in the east. And once ceasefire is declared, negotiate the best possible deal from there. Their strength was on the west side, so West Pakistan forces were to attack and capture as much territory as possible, while the east side was to defend its territory to gain an upper hand in the negotiations. Pakistan had two options for troops deployment on the east side, considering they were outnumbered and their objective was to defend against Indian ingress. Keep light defense formations throughout the countryside and focus most of their troops and combat capabilities to Dhaka. In this scenario, the Indian side would take most of the countryside very quickly, but soon would get bogged down in an urban conflict in the outskirts of Dhaka. Now, the Indian side would be forced to engage with the enemy that is well dug in. The Pakistan military and political establishment in Dhaka would remain secure till most of the Pakistan forces are decimated. This would lead to major losses to the Indian side. India would either be forced to do a neighborhood wise clear up or engage in siege warfare. Both the options would be considerably expensive and time consuming for the Indian side. Soon, the 8-week period would be up, passes along China would open, international pressure would be too much to handle, and eventually a ceasefire would be declared. The biggest disadvantage of this option was the Pakistan side would end up ceding a lot of territory over to India. This would put considerable pressure on West Pakistan to gain on the other front to balance out their positions during ceasefire negotiations. Option 2. Option 2 was to create a layered defense around Dhaka, with the first layer of thin border outposts along the border, the second layer of strong defense stronghold nodes along the paths or the axes that lead to Dhaka, a third layer of natural defense of huge rivers that surround the Dhaka bowl, and a final thin defense of troops defending Dhaka. The plan was for the outer defense to engage any ingress from the Indian forces and report the activity to the second layer. The second layer then activates its defense preparedness to block any further movements of Indian troops beyond that point. The terrain in the East Pakistan side was such that any troop movements would have to happen along the main road axis. Going off-road into the marshy ground was not feasible unless you knew the specific routes. Major advantage of this strategy was that very little territory would be lost to India in case these defenses held up. This will be very useful in the final ceasefire negotiations. A major disadvantage, though, was that if an Indian ingress from any direction was able to get past even one of these stronghold nodes, then Dhaka, which is so lightly defended, would be easily captured by the Indian side. After careful deliberations with his advisors, Lieutenant General A.A.K. Niazi, the GOCNC of East Pakistan, decided to go with option 2. Reason being, he was confident that his troops would be able to hold off the Indian troops at these defense strongholds for many months. Little to no territory will be lost. With their expectations from the operations to be carried out on the Western Front, this would be a net positive for Pakistan in the final negotiations. General Yahya Khan, Lieutenant General Tikka Khan, agreed with this assessment and gave the go-ahead to Niazi. The whole theory of the case for the East Pakistan's defense pivoted on the concept that the Indian forces will have no option but to engage with the well-dug-in Pakistan formations in these stronghold nodes, since they could not go around them through the marshy terrain. They were prepared to block the Indian side at these junctions for many months at a time. Based upon the above strategy, Pakistan started its build-up in the east. By October of 1971, it deployed 4 infantry divisions, along with 20,000 West Wing Rangers, paramilitary forces, and built up its strongholds. The government gave the following directive to the Indian military: liberate Bangladesh as quickly as possible. If attacked, fight a holding action in the west and in the north. Make limited gains in the west as a bargaining chip. This was a clear political directive from the government. The Indian commandos faced the dilemma of clearing out the enemy's strongholds along the axis to Dhaka. The enemy was well dug in, so this would be too costly, both in terms of time and men. In traditional warfare strategy, The attacking force typically initiates the assault by targeting the peripheral zones of its primary objective, subsequently engaging the main target, and finally consolidating its position to thwart any potential counterattacks before advancing to the next target. This strategy is highly time consuming, and the Indian forces faced a pressing timeline to accomplish their mission. The global situation would escalate with each passing week, and inevitably, by the 10th week, India would be compelled to redeploy forces along the China border as the mountain passes reopened. So the traditional war strategy was a no-go. That is when the Indian planners decided to go with the high-risk, high-reward strategy, Blitzkrieg. Under this plan, the Indian forces would rapidly move towards East Pakistan strongholds, and instead of engaging the enemy there, bypass them completely and do a quick dash towards the Dhaka Bowl. Dhaka, being lightly defended, would be forced to surrender without putting much of a fight, while the enemy strongholds remained isolated in their positions. Highly risky strategy because many things could go wrong here. First, the East Pakistan terrain. East Pakistan is a vast plain interspersed with the tributaries of three major rivers, Padma, Brahmaputra, and the Meghna. This plain has alluvial soil many feet thick. After the monsoon period, it is a country full of boglands, marshes, and rice fields. It is a nightmare for any meaningful cross-country military operations. The rivers are up to a mile or more in width, and hence formidable obstacles. If the bridges along the main road arteries are damaged, movement by any large force is extremely difficult. Speed was crucial for this plan to work, but any attacking force could easily get bogged down in the terrain and would be sitting ducks for an enemy attack. The only way this risk could be mitigated was with the help of someone who knew the tracks well. This is where the Indian forces relied on the Mukti Bahini. These trained guerrillas who knew the terrain in and out were to act as the Indian forces' eyes and ears in their attempt to bypass the enemy strongholds and getting to their final objective. Risk of encirclement. The other potential issue with this was as soon as the enemy found out that the Indian forces do not intend to fight them there, but are planning to go straight to Dhaka, they would come up from the rear and encircle the Indian forces. An encircled Indian force facing attacks from multiple ends would suffer very heavy losses. So a distraction element was to be deployed to engage with the strongholds of the enemy, to make them believe that an attack on them is imminent, while the main forces bypasses them. By the time the strongholds realize what was going on, the Indian forces would be able to cut off the enemy from pursuing them. The plan was risky and had to be executed with precision to be successful. To increase the chances of success, the Indian planners planned out the Blitzkrieg ingress strategy from multiple fronts and directions. This strategy gave the Indian side the advantage of redundancy. If one ingress somehow got bogged down, there are still others that can complete the mission. The Pakistan side had its defense strategy in place, and the Indian planners had their strategy to circumvent that. Both the sides had their plans, with their objectives clearly defined. It was now October 1971. The window of military engagement was getting near. What were the true positions of the Indian side? What were they on the Pakistan side in East Pakistan? Were both the sides ready for what was coming? How did the operations progress? All this will be covered in the next video. Please subscribe.